and there's various bits and bobs here. I decided I'd pursue the Ewings of Dumbartonshire in the records of the Scottish Parliament, which turned out to be quite interesting. In 1662, King Charles II put an act through the House in Edinburgh, and he wanted to kind of, it's quite unusual as a piece of law, because most of it is preamble, and he describes his view of the whole of the history of the wars, and he wants to make it clear that he's being incredibly merciful here, and that he's letting off the Scottish people where he really ought to take them all to task. But the people that he lets off are, let me just see. He says he's been pleased to indemnify all persons for their acting during and in relation to these troubles, accepting such as should be accepted by His Majesty in this Parliament. And he says how the peace and quiet of the kingdom was interrupted since the year 1637. And so that's, that's 25 years before this. And then he says how in 1648, some of the Covenanters, and I don't know, are you familiar with the concept of the Covenanters at all?
Yes,
most people are, and it was obviously in the 17th century Scotland, it was hugely important, the notion of a covenant. It went back into the 16th century, and it was basically a feeling that the Scottish people had that they'd done a deal with God, and the king was bound into that deal that they'd done. And for the Covenanters, it was completely sacred and unbreakable, and they couldn't believe that kings would actually treat it otherwise. But of course, one after another, they just showed that they thought nothing of the covenants that they signed up to. So after the Civil War, the Covenanters handed over the king to the English parliamentarians. But having done that, a lot of them decided that actually they wanted to see if they could do anything to bring the king back on board. And the king, after a while, realized what a powerless situation he was in, and he agreed to sign the covenant. And so there was a Scottish party that went to war against the English Parliament on the king's behalf. And they were called the Engagers because they were engaging with the king. And Scotland at this time was completely split between the Engagers and those that refused to engage. And so he says, where am I? Where in the year 1648, His Majesty's royal father, this is Charles II speaking of his father Charles I, of blessed memory, was secluded from his government and kept prisoner in the Isle of Wight, they, with much cheerfulness and loyalty, this is the Engagers, did engage in war for His Majesty's relief and restitution to his government. And so he goes on saying how glorious and good it was of those people to fight for his father. Whereas the other lot, after the Engagers had been defeated by Cromwell, entered into new and open rebellion. And so he goes on to list the people in every county that he's going to find. And within the Shire of Dumbarton, he lists 3 people. One of them is Colin Campbell of Ardencarry, one of them is Brown of Banclerch, and the other is Patrick Ewing in Dumbarton. Patrick Ewing is fined £600, which in American money today, I believe, is about $80,000. So that's one of the acts that I found. Then also 1649. This is when the Engagers have just been defeated, and at that point, Patrick Ewing is brought to prominence as one of the people who is in charge of the Shire of Dumbarton, in its defence and so on. And that, of course, is because all the Engagers were suddenly stripped of office. There's one other act which I'll mention briefly, which says that in 1597, so this is way early, Findlay Ewing is commended for acting against Hugh Berkeley, and it's saying that this was done for the good of king and country. And I have no idea what he did against Hugh Berkeley, but whatever it was, the king approved of it thoroughly. So there was obviously a tradition from the 1590s at least, which is recorded, of the Ewings of Dumbarton being quite prominent people who don't often kind of make it into parliamentary records, but from time to time they do. And I kind of have the sense that that's about the level that the Ewings that we've been talking about today around here are at. That they're the level of people that you don't notice on the national scale, but in the counties, they're there doing a lot of the work. And I think that maybe part of the explanation for why that is because they'd just stepped out of that role in Scotland. They went through Ireland, they came over here, and they carried on in about the same kind of social position that they'd been in before. Anyway, I said I'd talk about some of the earlier history as well. And the Ewings got to Dumbartonshire around Loch Lomond sometime around 1500, a little bit before probably. And the way that we know this is, again, there's a tradition which is recorded in the book Clan Ewing, Some Records of Its History, that the McEwens around Dumbarton were the relic of the clan that had once been in Argyll by Loch Fyne, and that they'd come there under their own chief. And so once again, whilst I don't know, I imagine that most people are familiar with the idea of the McEwens of Loch Fyne, and also with the notion that their chiefship ended in the 15th century. But there's an oral tradition which says that a new chief took them to the lands of Lennox by Loch Lomond. And so
Thor, let me say that most of these folks will know these as the McEwen of Otter.
McEwen of Otter,
that's right, the language they understand.
Yep, McEwen of Otter is the conventional name of that clan, and they were on the shores of Loch Fyne. And what happens is that in 1432, James I of Scotland comes back from being a captive in England, and Sweeney McEwen, the young chief of Clan Ewing of Otter, goes to Perth to, presumably in some kind of standard feudal ceremony, he surrenders his barony to the king, and the king grants it back to him. And so in this act, I imagine he's acknowledging the king's supremacy. But the king adds a little rider, which is that if Sweeney should die without a lawful heir, then the Campbells are to inherit. And the Campbells have supported the king all through his captivity and been strong advocates for his return. I guess that the McEwens hadn't been so solid in their support of the king. And part of the reason for that is actually, it's where they lived. Because the McEwens of Otter lived on the Cowal Peninsula, which is more or less the border between the old kingdom of Scots and the kingdom of the Isles. And the MacDonalds, and before them the and I forget that. Hang on. Anyway, before them another Mac had been kings of the Isles, and it'll come to me later. It's very irritating. That had been kings of the Isles, and they're very often referred to as lords of the Isles, but they styled themselves kings, and their rulership was not challenged until the time of King James I, indeed, who basically ousted them from their position as rulers. Although the kind of fighting went on for another 100 years or so after that. But the McEwens were in a position on the border, and so they had to look to two kings, and they had to be aware of that position.